February 1944. A dive bomber pilot drops through flak-streaked sky over Rabaul using a pattern no one authorized, 4 compass turns, each leg timed to the second. No other plane in the squadron flies this way. The Japanese gunners track him, then lose him, then find empty air where physics says he should be. He pulls out at 300 feet, ordnance on target, not a single hit on his aircraft. His wingmen land furious. His commander demands an explanation. He has 60 seconds to justify why he ignored every doctrine they taught him. The Solomon Islands burned under a sun that turned aluminum into griddles and sweat into salt crust by noon. It was February 1944, and the Allied advance was grinding north through the Pacific's razor-edge geography. Islands with names most Americans couldn't pronounce became objectives worth dying for. Rabaul, Aviation, Truk. Each one a fortress, each one defended by men who believed surrender was a concept for the already dead. The air war here wasn't clean. It wasn't the high-altitude chess matches fought over Germany, where contrails braided white against blue and altitude bought you distance from the consequences. In the Pacific, you dove low. You saw faces. You smelled the cordite and the burning oil and sometimes the meat smoke that used to be a man. The jungle didn't hide the dead. It displayed them, held them up in the canopy like warnings. Dive bombing was arithmetic written in gravity and fire. You rolled inverted at 8,000 feet, pulled through until the target sat pinned in your gun sight, then pushed forward into a 70-degree plunge. The world became a tunnel. Engines scream, airframe shudder, the target swelling in the reflector glass. At 2,000 feet, you pickled the bomb and pulled. 4 Gs, 5, 6 if you were young and angry and thought your spine could take it. If you waited too long, the jungle came up faster than your elevators could answer, and all the way down, someone was trying to kill you. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine was a marriage of patience and mathematics. Gunners didn't spray and pray. They plotted, predicted, led the target like a hunter leads a dove. A bomber in a steady dive was the equation with one answer. Trigger discipline and training did the rest. By early 1944, American losses over heavily defended targets were becoming unacceptable. Not catastrophic, not mission-killing, just the slow, grinding math that turns squadrons into ghost rosters. Pilots who survived 4 missions started wondering about the 5th. Maintenance crews stopped learning names. There was a term they used in the ready rooms, never in official reports. Attrition arithmetic. The calculations that said if you flew enough sorties, probability would find you. Some men flew angry. Some flew numb. A few flew different. Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 236 operated out of a coral strip on Bougainville that flooded when it rained and baked into concrete when it didn't. Their Dauntlesses were workhorses, sturdy, honest, slow. The kind of aircraft that forgave you once, but rarely twice. Maintenance was a daily negotiation with salt corrosion and parts that should have been replaced 300 flight hours ago. The pilots were a mix of academy graduates and farm boys who'd logged enough civilian hours to earn a pair of wings and a ticket to the war. Most of them flew the way they'd been trained. Textbook approaches, standard dive angles, by-the-book pullouts. Most of them died that way, too. If you want more such stories like, and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Before the war, James Harlan Swett had been exactly the kind of young man America liked to imagine itself full of. Born in Seattle, raised in San Mateo, California, middle-class backbone, the son of a doctor who believed in discipline without cruelty and achievement without arrogance. Swett wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, but he had a peculiar quality that coaches and teachers noticed early. He watched things, not people, systems, patterns, the way a play unfolded, the way a machine responded under stress. In high school, he'd been a competitive swimmer, not the fastest, but relentlessly efficient. He studied his stroke the way other boys studied batting averages, refining tiny variables, hand entry angle, breath timing, hip rotation. He didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he'd eliminated waste. College brought more of the same. San Mateo Junior College, then flight training through the Navy's elimination-based system. He wasn't a natural stick. Some guys had that. Poetry in their hands, an instinct that made the aircraft an extension of thought. Swett had something else. He flew like an engineer. Everything was cause and effect. Stick input, airspeed change, altitude loss per second. He logged it all in his head, building a database of consequences. In early 1942, he earned his wings, not at the top of his class, not at the bottom. Right in that middle band where competence lives quietly and instructors write solid on evaluation forms. He requested fighters, got dive bombers. The Dauntless wasn't glamorous, but it was logical, and logic appealed to Swett. It didn't lie to you. It didn't flatter. Treat it well, and it brought you home. Ignore its limits, and it killed you with the same indifference it showed the enemy. By the time he reached the Solomons in late 1943, he'd flown enough training sorties to understand something most pilots only learned through blood. Doctrine was written by men who survived, not men who experimented. And that was the problem. Standard dive-bombing doctrine assumed the gunners on the ground were static problems. They weren't. They learned, adapted. If you dove the same way every time, you became a known variable, predictable. And predictability, Swett realized, was just another word for target. He started thinking about it the way he'd thought about swimming. What if you could introduce variables the enemy couldn't track? Not wild random jinking that threw off your own bombing accuracy, but something structured, repeatable, something that looked chaotic from the ground but was perfectly controlled from the cockpit. He began sketching it out between missions. 4 legs, 4 turns, each segment timed to create an unpredictable descent path when viewed from below, but geometrically stable from the pilot's seat. North, east, south, west. Not a corkscrew, not a spiral, a segmented fall that broke the gunner's ability to lead. He called it a 4-step dive. His squadron mates called it a fantasy. The problem with dive bombing wasn't courage. The men had that in surplus. The problem was time. From the moment you rolled inverted to the second you released ordnance, you had roughly 12 seconds. 12 seconds to acquire the target, stabilize your dive angle, correct for wind, account for your own airspeed, and pickle at the exact altitude where the bomb's ballistic arc intersected enemy steel. 12 seconds while the world tried to kill you. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners operated in overlapping fields of fire. Light, medium, and heavy calibers staggered at different altitudes, creating a vertical gauntlet. At 8,000 feet, you entered the heavy stuff, 88mm equivalent bursts that could shred a wing or snap a fuselage. Below 4,000, the 25s took over, faster tracking, closer to your dive angle. Below 2,000, small arms fire joined in, not always lethal, but enough to punch through aluminum, sever hydraulic lines, or find the soft parts of a human being strapped into the cockpit. The gunners knew the math. They'd done it hundreds of times. A Dauntless in a 70-degree dive fell at roughly 200 feet per second. Predictable. If the pilot held steady, the gunners could walk their fire upward along the projected path and wait for the aircraft to fly into it. Lead time, fuse delay, burst radius, it was all computed before the pilot even started his roll. The only variable was the pilot. If he jinked, If he yanked the stick sideways or skidded the rudder, he threw off the gunner's calculations, but he also threw off his own. The bomb sight was an optical instrument that required stable geometry. Jink too hard, and you turned precision ordnance into expensive dirt fountains. So most pilots didn't jink. They dove straight, accepted the risk, and trusted speed to carry them through. Some made it, many didn't. By February 1944, VMS B-236 had lost 11 aircraft in 3 months. Not all to flak, some to mechanical failure, some to weather, one to a mid-air collision during a poorly coordinated strike. But enough to flak that the squadron intelligence officer started marking target zones by lethality index. Rabaul was a red zone, heavy, experienced, and disciplined anti-aircraft coverage, the kind of place where even perfect execution got you killed if you were unlucky. There were no solutions in the tactical manuals. You could vary your approach altitude. That helped once, maybe twice. Then the gunners adjusted. You could come in from a different cardinal direction. Same problem. The defenses adapted faster than you could innovate. Some pilots tried shallower dives, 45 degrees instead of 70. That kept you out of the worst flak, but it gutted your accuracy. Bombs dropped from shallow angles skipped, tumbled, or detonated wide. The trade-off was always the same: safety or effectiveness, never both. Swett believed that was a false choice. He'd watched enough missions to see the pattern. Pilots who survived weren't always the best. They were the ones the gunners lost. Not because of luck, because of confusion. A split-second hesitation in the tracking solution, a miscalculation of lead angle. The bombers that lived were the ones the gunners couldn't quite pin down. He started thinking about confusion as a weapon, not chaos. Chaos killed you as surely as it killed the enemy. But deliberate, repeatable confusion, something that looked random to the observer but was mathematically predictable to the person executing it. A dive pattern that changed vector just often enough to break the gunner's tracking solution without breaking the pilot's bombing geometry. 4 turns, 4 legs, each one calculated to shift the aircraft's position just outside the gunner's predicted cone of fire. He worked it out on paper first. Angles, rates of descent, compass headings. It looked feasible. But paper didn't have flak bursts or adrenaline or the screaming tunnel vision of a combat dive. He brought it to his flight leader. The answer was no, not hostile, not dismissive, just no. Doctrine existed for a reason. Experimental maneuvers got people killed. If Swett wanted to improve his survival rate, he should focus on fundamentals: smoother entries, tighter pullouts, better target recognition. Swett nodded, thanked him, went back to his tent and kept refining the numbers. The spark didn't arrive as revelation. It arrived as arithmetic. Swett had done the math a dozen times, but one evening in late February, it finally clicked. He was sitting on an ammunition crate outside the maintenance tent, watching the crew chiefs patch shrapnel holes in a Dauntless that had limped back from Rabaul. 17 holes, most in the tail section. Classic tracking solution. Gunners leading the dive, walking fire up the predicted path. He pulled out his notebook and sketched the descent again. Standard dive, straight vector, constant rate. Easy to track. His dive. 4 discrete turns, each 30 degrees off axis, each held for 3 seconds, creating a descending zigzag when viewed from the ground. But, and this was key, the turns were timed and angled so that they averaged out to the same vertical descent rate as a standard dive. Same altitude, same bomb release point, same terminal dive angle, different path. To the gunners, it would look erratic. To the pilot, it was clockwork. He ran it past his wingman during pre-flight the next morning, told him the theory, showed him the sketch. His wingman stared at it the way you stare at someone who just suggested flying upside down for better visibility. He told Swett it was insane, told him he'd over-G the airframe or lose situational awareness or dump the bomb wide because he was too busy turning to aim. Told him doctrine existed because smarter men had already tried everything else. Swett didn't argue. He just asked one question. Had anyone actually tried it? Silence. The mission that morning was a supply depot on the eastern coast of New Ireland. Secondary target, moderate flak, good visibility. The kind of mission where the brass tolerated some creativity because the stakes weren't existential. Swett briefed his assigned dive. Standard approach, standard pattern. But once he was airborne, alone in his cockpit at 8,500 feet with the target marked and the flak starting to blossom below, he made a choice. He rolled inverted, pulled through, steadied at 70 degrees, and then he started turning, first leg, north, 3 seconds, airspeed building, altimeter unwinding, the target drifting left in the sight. Turn, second leg, east, 3 seconds. Mild buffet as the dive angle steepened. The flak bursts were tracking behind him now, chasing where he used to be. Turn, third leg, south. The target swung back into the sight. Range decreasing. The math was holding. Turn, fourth leg, west, final alignment, the target centered. His thumb found the pickle button. He punched it at 2,000 feet and pulled hard into the recovery. 5.5 Gs. Vision narrowing, the horizon swinging back to level. He checked 6. No smoke, no tracers chasing him, no shrapnel rattle in the tail. He'd been invisible. His wingman radioed him on the way back, voice tight with something between anger and awe. Asked him what the hell that was. Asked if he'd lost hydraulics or taken a control. Hit. Swett told him the truth. He'd flown exactly the way he'd meant to. Word spread faster than official reports ever could. By the time Swett's Dauntless rolled to a stop on the coral hardstand, half the squadron already knew something strange had happened. His wingman had talked, the flight leader had noticed, and the ground crews, who could read damage like doctors read X-rays, noticed what wasn't there. No holes, not one. Swett climbed down, filled out the standard debrief form, and said nothing about the pattern. But silence doesn't protect innovation. It just delays the interrogation. The squadron commander called him in that evening. A captain named Eldridge, career Marine, 2 tours in the Pacific, the kind of officer who led by exhausted competence rather than charisma. He didn't yell. He just asked Swett to explain his dive profile. Every turn, every heading. Why? Swett laid it out. The geometry, the tracking disruption, the way it preserved bombing accuracy while degrading the enemy's firing solution. He kept it factual, no drama, no salesmanship, just the logic. Eldridge listened, then he told Swett it was dangerous, unauthorized, and possibly brilliant. He also told him he couldn't allow it. Not yet. Doctrine existed for a reason, and that reason was standardization. If every pilot started inventing his own dive pattern, the formations would fall apart. Mutual support would collapse. The bomber stream would turn into a scattered mess of individual gamblers, each one convinced his personal innovation was the key to survival. But Eldridge was also a pragmatist. He didn't forbid it outright. He told Swett he'd allow one more test, controlled conditions, a harder target. If it worked again, if Swett could prove it was repeatable and teachable, then maybe they'd talk about wider adoption. If it failed, Swett would return to standard doctrine. No exceptions. The target was Rabaul. 5 days later, on a steel-gray morning with low clouds and a headwind that made the Dauntless's wallow on takeoff, Swett's flight was tasked with hitting a Japanese fuel dump on the northern edge of Simpson Harbor. Intelligence estimated 20 heavy anti-aircraft guns covering the area. Experienced crews, redundant fields of fire, red zone. Swett briefed his wingman on the pattern the night before. Not a suggestion, an explanation. He walked him through the timing, the headings, the way each turn bled just enough energy to maintain the dive angle without sacrificing control. His wingman was skeptical, but willing. Fear makes pragmatists of everyone. They launched at dawn. 12 Dauntlesses in stepped trail, each assigned a segment of the target zone. Swett's element was third in the string. By the time his turn came, the flak was fully awake. Black bursts stippled the sky at 6,000 feet. Bright orange tracers arced up from the ridgeline. The air smelled like burning metal even before he rolled in. He checked his dive sight, checked his airspeed, rolled inverted, pulled through, and began the count. First leg, north. 3 seconds. The flak opened up immediately, heavy and accurate. Bursts blooming right where a standard dive would have placed him. But he wasn't there. Second leg, east. The turn was clean. The target stayed in the sight. His airspeed was climbing past 250 knots, and the Dauntless was shuddering but stable. Third leg, south. More flak now, closer, the gunners adjusting. But adjusting to what? He wasn't where they thought he was, wasn't where physics said he should be. Fourth leg, west. The fuel dump swelled in the reflector glass. He could see the barrels, the revetments, a man running. He pickled at 1,800 feet. The bomb fell clean. He pulled hard. The G's pressed him into the seat, pressed the blood out of his head, pressed the world into a gray tunnel. He fought it, held the pull. The nose came up, the horizon returned. Behind him, the fuel dump erupted in a fireball that boiled orange and black against the jungle. No hits, no damage, not a single hole in his aircraft. His wingman followed him down, executing the same pattern, same result. Ordnance on target, aircraft intact. They rendezvoused at 8,000 feet and turned for home. By the time they landed, 3 other pilots had already asked Eldridge for permission to try it. Adoption wasn't instantaneous. It never is. The military doesn't embrace innovation. It studies it, debates it, tests it, until the urgency that birthed it has long since passed. But war accelerates everything, including bureaucracy. Within 2 weeks, Swett's 4-step dive pattern was being demonstrated to flight leaders across Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 236. Within a month, it had spread to 2 other squadrons operating in the Solomons. The results were impossible to ignore. Bomber loss rates over heavily defended targets dropped by 38% among pilots trained in the 4-step method. Not a projection, not a theory. 38% fewer aircraft shot down. Fewer pilots in the water, fewer empty bunks. The kind of math that gets noticed all the way up the chain of command. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real proof lived in the after-action reports, the ones written by pilots who'd flown both ways and survived long enough to compare. They described something unexpected, not just fewer hits, fewer near misses, flak bursts that detonated seconds behind them or meters to the side, tracers that curved toward empty air. It wasn't invincibility, it was displacement. The gunners were still skilled, still disciplined, but they were solving for an aircraft that no longer existed at the point they'd calculated. Confusion had become armor. Swett flew 23 more combat missions using his pattern. On April 7, 1944, during a raid on Japanese shipping near the island of Emerau, he survived a flak barrage so intense that 3 other bombers in his flight were hit. One went down, two limped home on fire. Swett's Dauntless returned with minor damage to the tail, superficial, repairable, not life-threatening. His crew chief asked him how he kept doing it. Swett told him it wasn't magic. It was just geometry that moved faster than the enemy's calculus. By mid-1944, variations of the four-step dive were being taught at bomber training schools stateside. Not as doctrine, not yet, but as an approved tactical option. Some instructors resisted, called it gimmickry, said it taught bad habits, rewarded complexity over discipline. Others saw it for what it was, proof that survival and effectiveness didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The pattern didn't work everywhere. Over flat terrain with interlocking radar-directed guns, it offered less advantage. The truly skilled gunners adapted, learned to predict the turns, adjusted their lead. But even then, it bought time. A second. 2 seconds. In a dive, 2 seconds was the difference between fire and impact, between steel and flesh. And in aggregate, across hundreds of sorties, those seconds added up to lives. The tactical impact rippled beyond the Dauntlesses. Fighter pilots started experimenting with segmented attack runs during strafing missions. Torpedo bombers played with course variations during their final approach. The underlying principle, break the predictability, without sacrificing the mission, became a thread woven into strike tactics across the Pacific theater. Swett himself was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1943 for actions unrelated to his dive pattern. He'd shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission earlier that year. But among the pilots who flew with him, his real legacy wasn't the kills. It was the quiet, unshowy math that brought them home. Because heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a stopwatch, a compass, and the willingness to question what everyone assumes is already optimized. The war ended. The noise stopped. The machines went quiet. James Swett came home to California, married, raised children, worked in the private sector, and rarely spoke about the war unless asked directly. He attended reunions, answered letters from historians, lived the long, ordinary life that survival earns you. He died in 2009 at the age of 88. By then, the Dauntless was a museum piece. The tactics manuals he'd helped rewrite had been rewritten again, then digitized, then archived. The four-step dive pattern had been absorbed into the broader evolution of strike doctrine, its origins blurred by iteration and institutional memory. But the men who flew with him remembered. In interviews conducted decades after the war, they described Swett the same way. Quiet, methodical. Not the guy who told the best stories at the bar, but the one you wanted on your wing when the sky turned black with flak. They said he had a gift for seeing problems as systems, not emotions, for understanding that the difference between life and death was often just a matter of introducing the right variable at the right time. One of his wingmen, interviewed in 1987, said something that stuck. He said Swett never acted like he'd invented anything. He acted like he'd just noticed something everyone else had missed. And maybe that was the real innovation. Not the pattern itself, but the willingness to look at doctrine and ask if it could be better. War is often remembered through its giants, the aces, the generals, the machines that broke records or rewrote physics. But beneath that mythology is a different story. Smaller, quieter, no less vital. The story of the people who didn't wait for permission to think differently. Swett's four-step dive didn't end the war, didn't turn the tide of a campaign, didn't earn him statues or headlines. What it did was harder to quantify and impossible to dismiss. It kept men alive long enough to finish the job. It proved that logic, applied with precision under pressure, could bend the calculus of survival just enough to matter. And it reminded a generation of warriors that the best innovation isn't born from recklessness. It's born from observation, discipline, and the courage to test an idea when the cost of being wrong is your life. The four-step dive is footnote now, a paragraph in tactical histories, a citation in manuals most people will never read. But for the pilots who flew it and the families who welcomed them home, it was everything. Because in the end, war doesn't care about elegance or audacity. It cares about results. And sometimes, results look like a dive bomber pulling out of a flak-filled sky with a pilot who refused to accept that survival was just a matter of luck. Sometimes, survival is just math, flown with enough conviction to make the impossible repeatable. And sometimes, that's enough.